The marvels and the flaws that I'll be talking about are the marvels and the flaws of intuitive thinking. It's a topic about which I've been thinking for a long time, a little over 40 years. I wanted to show you actually a picture of my collaborator in this early work. And what I'll be trying to do today is to sort of bring this up to date. So I'll tell you a bit about the beginnings, and I'll tell you a bit about how I think about it today. So this is Amos Tversky, with whom I did the early work on judgment and decision-making. And I show this picture in part because I like it, but in part because I like very much the next one. And that's what Amos Tversky looked like when the work was being done. And I have always thought that this pairing of the very distinguished person and the person who is actually doing the work tells you something about when good science is being done and about who is doing good science. And it's people like that who are having a lot of fun, who are doing good science, I think. We focused a lot on flaws of intuition and of intuitive thinking. And actually, I can tell you how the thing began. It began with a conversation about whether people are good intuitive statisticians or not. And there was a claim at the University of Michigan by some people with whom Amos has studied that people are good intuitive statisticians. I was teaching statistics at the time, and I was convinced that this was completely false. Not only because my students were not good intuitive statisticians, because I knew I wasn't. And my intuitions about things were just quite poor, in fact. And this has remained one of the mysteries, and it's one of the things that I'd like to talk about today, is what are the difficulties of statistical thinking, and why is it so difficult? So we ended up studying something that we called heuristics and biases. So those were shortcuts, and each shortcut was identified by the biases with which it came. And the biases had two functions in that story. I mean, they were interesting in themselves, but they were also the primary evidence for the existence of the heuristics. That is, if you want to characterize how something is done, then actually one of the most powerful ways of characterizing the way the mind does anything is by looking at the errors that the mind produces while it's doing it, because the errors tells you what it is actually doing. Correct performance tells you much less about the procedure than the errors do. So we focused on errors. And that created, we became completely identified, I think, the two of us, with the idea that people are wrong, and people are generally wrong. And we were sort of almost became like prophets of irrationality, that we are the, we demonstrate that people are not rational. We never liked this, actually. And one of the reasons we didn't was that we were our own best subjects. And we never thought we were stupid. But we never did anything that didn't work on us. So it's not that we're studying the errors of other people. We were really constantly studying the way our own mind works. And even when we knew better, we were able to tell what were the mistakes that were tempting to us. And basically, we try to characterize what are the tempting mistakes. Now, that was 40 years ago. And a fair amount has happened in the last 40 years. Not so much, I would say, about the work that we did in terms of the findings that we had pretty much have stood. But it's the interpretation of them, I think, has changed quite a bit. And it is now easier, I think, than it was to speak about the mechanisms that we had very little idea about, and to speak about, to put in balance the flaws that we were talking about with the marvels of intuition. Because we spent most of our time on flaws because this is what we were doing. we did not intend the message that was in fact conveyed, that the flaws are what this is about. In fact, you know, I mean, this is something that really happens quite a lot, at least in psychology, and I suppose it may happen in other sciences as well, is that you get an impression of the relative importance of two topics by how much time is spent on them when you're teaching them. But you're teaching what's happening now. You're teaching what's recent, what's current, what's considered interesting. And so there is a lot more to say about flaws and about marvels. So, you know, the mind, most of the time, everything we do is just fine. And, you know, how long can you spend saying that most of what we do is just fine? So you focus a lot on what is not fine. And then the students and the field get the impression that you're only interested in what is not fine. And that is something that happened to us fairly early. We didn't do enough to combat it. There's very little you can do to combat it because most of your work is about flaws. But in recent years, I think, it is becoming more even. We are understanding the flaws and the marvels a little better than we did. And one of the things that were not entirely clear to us when we started, and that have become a lot clearer now, is that there are really two ways that thoughts come to mind. So that's one way that a thought can come to mind. And, you know, it involves orderly computation and doing things in stages and remembering rules and applying rules. And then there is another way that thoughts come to mind. And you see this lady, and she's angry. And you know that she's angry as quickly as you know that her hair is dark. And furthermore, so there is no sharp line between intuition and perception. You perceive her as angry. Perception is predictive. You know what she's going to say, or at least you know something about what it's going to sound like. And so perception and intuition are very closely linked. It's really, in my mind, there never was a very clean separation between perception and intuition. And that, I should add, because, you know, the social context we're in here, you can't ignore evolution in anything that you do or say. But for us, certainly for me, the main thing, the evolutionary story about intuition, was that intuition grew out of perception, and that it grew out of the predictive aspects of perception, and that if you want to understand intuition, it is actually very useful to understand perception, because so many of the rules that apply to perception apply as well to intuitive thinking. Now, intuitive thinking is quite different from perception. Intuitive thinking has language. Intuitive thinking has a lot of world knowledge organized in different ways than mere perception, but some very basic characteristics that we'll talk about of perception are extended almost directly into intuitive thinking. So what we understand today much better, I think, than what we did then, is that there are two, crudely speaking, two families of mental operations. And I'll call them type 1 and type 2 for the time being, because this is the cleaner language. Then I'll adopt a language that is less clean and I think much more useful. Type 1 is automatic, effortless, often unconscious, and associatively coherent, and I'll talk about that. And type 2 is controlled, effortful, usually conscious, tends to be logically coherent, rule-governed, and what you do, perception and intuition are type 1. Roughly, it's a rough and crude characterization. Practice skill is type 1. That's essential. The thing that we really know how to do, like driving or speaking or understanding language and so on, they're type 1. And that makes them automatic and largely effortless and essentially impossible to control. And type 2 is more controlled, is slower, is more deliberate, and Gazzaniga was saying yesterday that type 2 is who we think we are. But, you know, I would say that, you know, if one made a film out of a book that I'm writing on this, then type 2 would be a secondary character who thinks that he is the hero, because he is, you know, that's who we think we are. But in fact, it's type 1 that does most of the work, and most of the work is completely hidden from us. And so that is now, I wouldn't say it's generally accepted, not everybody accepts it, but many people in cognitive and in social psychology accept that general classification of families of mental operations as really quite basic and fundamental. And there has been in the last 15 years, I would say, huge progress in our understanding of what is going on, especially in our understanding of type 1 thought processes. And I think I'd like to start with this example because I think it's nice. This is a report of a study that was carried out in a kitchen at some university in the UK. And that kitchen has an honesty system where people put in money when they buy tea and milk. And I think this is per liter of milk consumed. And somebody had the bright idea of putting a poster right on top of where the milk and the tea are, and of changing the poster every week. And you can see that the posters alternate week by week. They alternate flowers and eyes. And then you can see how much people are paying. It starts from the bottom, which is the biggest effect. And, you know, this thing, I think, speaks for itself. And it shows the enormous amount of control that there is, a thing that people are completely unaware of. Nobody knew that the posters had anything to do with anything. But the posters are eyes, the eyes are symbols, somebody is watching, and that has an effect, and you contribute more. And so the power of settings, and the power of priming, and the power of unconscious thinking, all of this is a major change in psychology. I mean, I can't think of a bigger change in my lifetime. You know, you were asking what's exciting. That's exciting to me. And we want to understand, so this is an extreme case of, you know, type 1. It's completely unconscious and very powerful, mixes cognition and motivation in a way that is inextricable and has a lot of control over behavior. Now, okay. Let me propose what's happened in your minds over the last few seconds as you were looking at this play of two words. And actually, everything that I'm going to say is very well defended in recent research, mostly in research of the last 10, 15 years. So you saw those two words. People recoiled from the word vomit. They actually moved backward, and that has been measured. You make a face of disgust. It's not very obvious, but there is a disgust face being made. You feel a bit bad. The disgust face makes you feel worse, because we know that shaping people's face into a particular expression changes the way they think and the way they feel. All of this happens. You are now prepared, then something else happens. You have those two words that have nothing to do with each other. You made a story. That is, there is now a connection between those two. The banana has somehow caused the vomit. And temporarily, you're off bananas. You know, this will pass, but temporarily, you're off bananas. You don't. This is not something you want. Quite interesting. What happens is that your associative structure, your associative memory, and I'm going to be speaking mostly of what happens in associative memory. Your associative memory has changed shape. That is, you have to think of it as a huge repository of ideas linked to each other in many ways, including causal links and other links, and activation spreading from ideas to other ideas until a small subset of that enormous network is illuminated, and that subset is what's happening in the mind at the moment. You're not conscious of it. You're conscious of very little of it. But this is actually what happens. And among the links that are activated, so anything to do with vomit is going to be activated. So it's not, so all the words, sickness, hangover, you name it. And the fact that they're activated means that you're prepared for them. And this is a very interesting function of this whole arrangement. You have a mini reaction to what is happening that is sort of a replica, a faint replica of reacting to the real event. And it prepares you for things that will go next. And being prepared means that you will need less stimulation in order to recognize a word. So that's the main thing. You know, the amount of energy that it takes for a word to register is going to be sharply reduced for all the words that have to do with vomit and many of the words that have to do with bananas. Now, links are going to be created, and in particular, and that's a fascinating part of it, you made up a story, you made up a causal story. That is, the vomit, which looks like an effect here, is looking for causes. And so you're making up scenarios. All of this is happening involuntarily. Most of it is happening unconsciously. But you are primed and you're ready for what comes next after that particular story of bananas causing vomit. One of the things that I find most striking about this whole story that we've learned in the past 10, 15 years is, I call it associative coherence. That is, everything reinforces everything else. And that is really something that we know. You make people recoil, they turn negative. You make people shake their heads. You know, you put earphones on people's heads. And you tell them we're testing those earphones for integrity. So we'd like to move your head while listening to a message. And you have them move their head this way or move their head that way. And you give them a political message. And they believe it if they're doing this. And they don't believe it if they're doing that. And so, you know, those are not huge effects, but they are effects. I mean, they're easily shown with a conventional number of subjects, highly reliable. So the thing about the system, it settles onto a stable representation of reality. And that, I think, is just a marvelous accomplishment. That's a marvel. This is not, you know, that's not a flaw. That's a marvel. Now, coherence has its cost. Coherence means that you are going to adopt one interpretation in general. Ambiguity tends to be suppressed. This is really part of the mechanism that you have here, that things, ideas activate other ideas, and the more coherent they are, the more likely they are to receive and give activation to each other. And other things that don't fit fall by the wayside. So we're enforcing a coherent interpretation. We see the world as much more coherent than it is. And that is something that we see in perception as well. You know, I mean, I didn't want to show you too many slides. I've been warned against slides. But we see that in perception as well. You show people ambiguous stimuli. They're not aware of the ambiguity. They pick it. I'll give you an example. It's not on a slide. You hear the word bank. And most people interpret bank, you know, as a place with vaults and money and so on. But in the context of if you're reading about streams and fishing, bank means something else. You're not conscious when you're getting one that you are getting the other. If you are, you're not conscious ever. But it's possible that both meanings are activated, but one gets quickly suppressed. And so that mechanism of creating coherent interpretations is something that happens. And subjectively, what happens, I keep using the word happens, this is not something we do. This is something that happens to us. And the same is true for perception. You know, I mean, for Plato, it was ideas sort of thrusting themselves into our eyes. And that's the way we feel. We are passive when it comes to system one. When it comes to system two and to deliberate thoughts, we are the authors of our own actions. The phenomenology of it is radically different. So that's, I wanted to give you a sense of, you know, the way I think about intuitive thinking these days. And from that point, I make a move that many people are going to be very angry with me about. Instead of talking about type 1 and type 2 processes, I actually adopt terminology. It's not mine, but the people who proposed it have now repudiated and have moved to type 1 and type 2. I use system 1 and system 2. And I say system 1 does all sorts of things, and system 2 does other things, and I basically describe what is going on in our mind as a psychodrama between two fictitious characters. So system 1 is one character, and system 2 is another character, and they battle it out, and they each have their own preferences and their own ways of doing things. And I will apologize ahead of time why I'm doing this, because I don't really believe that there are systems in the brain. I mean, you know, systems in the sense of interacting parts and so on. But it turns out that our memory and our minds are shaped in such a way that certain operations are a lot easier for us than others. And a book that we read recently that I really recommend to anybody who hasn't read it is Moonwalking with Einstein. And in that book, what's his name? Joshua Foer. He described how in 1 year he turned himself into the memory champion of the United States, using techniques that have been around since the Greeks, I think. Of course, the Greeks. And the point that he makes is really quite straightforward. We are very, very bad at remembering lists. We are very, very good at remembering routes. We can remember routes, we don't remember lists. If you arrange a list along a route, you're going to remember the list. And that's basically the idea. Now, it turns out there's something else we're awfully good at. We're good at taking an agent and assigning characteristics to that agent and remembering that this agent had these habits and it does these things. And if you want to learn about system 1 and system 2 or about type 1 and type 2 operations, really the same, I advise, think of it as system 1. It will develop a personality. There are certain things that it likes doing, that it's able to do, and there are certain things it just cannot do. And you'll get that image. It's completely crazy. I mean, there is no such thing. At the same time, I find it enormously useful. And it's quite funny. I mean, I'm losing friends over this. I mean, you know, people will tell me you're bringing psychology backward 50 years because the idea of having little people in the mind is supposed to be a grave sin. I accept it's a grave sin. It really helps you think. When you think of those characters in the mind with their characteristics. So I'll give you a few. What can system 1 do? That is, what operations, you know, so I'll give you one example of the translation. what operations are conducted automatically and without thinking. So here is one. We can detect incongruity and abnormality automatically and without thinking, and very, very quickly. And the subtlety of it is amazing. To give you an example, you have, that's my favorite, you have an upper-class British voice, a male British voice, saying, I have tattoos, I have large tattoos all down my back. 250 milliseconds, the brain has a response. Something is wrong. People who speak in upper-class British voices don't have large tattoos down their back. A large tattoo down their back. A male voice saying, I believe I am pregnant. 200 milliseconds later, males don't become pregnant. So this is something that happens. The world knowledge that is brought to bear is enormous. I mean, the amount of information that you would have to know and to be able to bring to bear instantly in order to know this something incongruous here. And that happens at a speed that is extraordinary. I mean, you know, this is just about as fast as you can pick out anything in the brain. Between 200 and 400 milliseconds, there's a full-blown surprise response. So that's one of the things that System 1 does. System 1 infers and invents causes and intentions. And that, again, is something that happens automatically. Infants have it. I mean, you know, we were exposed to that. Infants can recognize intention and have a system that enables them to divine what are the intentions of objects that they see on a screen, like one object chasing another. This is something that an infant will recognize. An infant will expect one object that chases another to take the most direct route toward the other, not to follow the path, but actually to try to catch up. This is an infant less than 1 year old. So clearly we're equipped, and that is something that we have inherited, we're equipped for the perception of causality. Neglects ambiguity and suppresses doubt, I've mentioned. Exaggerates coherence, I've mentioned associative coherence, and in large part, this is really, that's where marvels turn into flaws. We see a world that is vastly more coherent than the world actually is. That's because of this coherence creating mechanism that we have a sense-making organ in our heads, and we tend to see things that are emotionally coherent and that are associatively coherent. So all these are doings of System 1. Another property I've given it, the acronym, what you see is all there is. And that it is a mechanism that tends not to be sensitive to information it does not have. Very important to have a mechanism like that. And that came up in one of the talks yesterday. This is a mechanism that takes whatever information is available and makes the best possible story out of the information currently available and tells you very little about information it doesn't have. So you can get people jumping to conclusions. I call this a machine for jumping to conclusions. And the jumping to conclusions is immediate and very small samples. Furthermore, not only small samples, unreliable information. I mean, you can give details and say this information is probably not reliable. And unless it is actually rejected as a lie, people will draw full inferences from it.
The acronym, I assume, is what you see.
What you see is all there is.
Right.
Yeah. What you see is all there is. Now, that will very often create a flaw. It will create overconfidence. That is, the confidence that people have in their beliefs is not a measure of the quality of evidence. It is not a judgment of the quality of evidence. It is a judgment of the coherence of the story that the mind has managed to construct. And quite often, actually, you can construct very good stories out of very little evidence. I mean, when there is little evidence, no conflict. So the story is going to end up good, and people tend to have great belief, great faith in stories that are based on very little evidence. I could go on because there are lots of... Now, it generates what Amos and I call natural assessments. That is, there are computations that get performed automatically. So automatically, for example, we get computations of the distance between us and other objects. It is not something that we need to that we intend to do. This is something that happens to us in the normal run of perception. But we don't compute everything. So there is a subset of computations that we perform, and other computations we don't. So, whoops. Oh, all right. I messed up. I'll go back in a minute. You see this array of lines. There is evidence, among others, Anne, my wife, has collected some evidence. People register the average length of these lines effortlessly in one glance while doing something else. So the extraction of information about a prototype is immediate. But now, if you were asked, what is the sum, what is the total length of these lines? You can't do this. That is, it's not generated. You got the average for free. You didn't get the sum for free. In order to get the sum, you'd have to get an estimate of the number and an estimate of the average and multiply the average by the number, and then you'll get something. But you did not get that as a natural assessment. So there is a really important distinction, I think, between natural assessments and things that are not natural assessments. So that there are questions that are easy for the organism to answer, and other questions that are difficult for the organism to answer. And that makes a lot of difference. Now, while I'm at it, the difference between average and sums is an important difference, because there are variables that have the characteristic that I will call them sum-like. I mean, they're extensional. They're sum-like variables. So economic value is a sum-like variable. And here is a nice experiment by Christopher Shee. He asks people to bid for sets of dishes. So you have set A and you have set B. And there are two conditions in the experiment. In one condition, people see this display. In the other condition, they see set A separately or set B. Now, when you do it in this condition, the solution is easy. Set A is worth more than set B. It's got more dishes. When you see them separately, set B is valued a lot more, like $10 more than set A, because the average value of the dishes is higher in set B than in set A, and we register the prototype, and we fail to see the other. Now that happens all over the place. Among other things, by the way, probability is a sum-like variable. So the probability adds up over components. But we judge it as if it was an average-like variable. And a lot of the errors in probability judgment come from that type of confusion. Now, there are two other characteristics that I want to mention of what System 1 is capable of doing. It is capable of matching intensities. And this is really fairly mysterious how it does it, but I'll give you an example. Julie, I say, read fluently when she was age 4. Okay? Now I could ask you, how many stories, a building of how many stories is as tall as Julie's reading capacity was? And you can do it. And when I say you can do it, there will be substantial agreement. That is, some people, will say 2 stories. That's just not enough. And 25 stories may be too much. We have an idea. We have an idea of the GPA that matches. What GPA matches? And interestingly enough, when you ask people to predict Julie's GPA, you say she's graduating from Yale now. They predict the GPA by matching the GPA to their impression of how well she read at age 4, which is a ridiculous way of doing it, but that's what people do. So matching intensity across dimensions is something that System 1 is capable of doing, and it's extremely useful because, as you'll see, it allows people to answer the wrong question, which is what we do, I think, most of the time. Now, computes more than intended, the mental shotgun, is you have an intention to do something, to accomplish something, and typically what this generates is multiple performances, not a single activity, but many things at once will happen. So here's an example. Do these words rhyme? And here people hear the words. They don't see them. I'm showing them to you, but they don't see them. They hear the words. Vote, note, vote, goat. Both of them rhyme. People are much slower when they hear the words of a speaker saying that vote, goat rhymes than that vote, note rhymes. How do you explain that? Well, they have generated the spelling. They're not supposed to generate the spelling. Nobody asked them to generate the spelling. It's just in the way. They can't help it. They're asked one question. They answer other questions. Are these sentences literally true? And you spend time explaining that this is not metaphor. We don't want you to compute metaphors. Some roads are snakes is really slow to be rejected as literally true because it is metaphorically true. So people compute the metaphor even when they're not supposed to compute the metaphor. Some jobs are jails. People are very slow. Some jobs are snakes, very easy. There is no metaphor. So what you get, the image that I'm trying to draw of how System 1 works, it is a mental shotgun. It computes a lot more than it's required to compute. And sometimes, one of the things that it computes turns out to be so much faster than what it's trying to compute that it will generate the wrong thing. So the main things that Emma Struski and I worked with are cases in which similarity is used instead of probability. So our most famous example is a lady named Linda. I don't know how many of you have heard of Linda. Linda, well, she studied philosophy, college, and most people think she was at Berkeley. She participated in anti-nuclear marches. She was very active. She's very bright. And 10 years have passed. And what is she now? Is she an accountant? No. Is she a bank teller? No. Is she a feminist? Yes. is she a feminist bank teller? Yeah. I mean, and you can see what happens. She is a feminist bank teller because she, in terms of similarity, it's perfect to say that she is more like a feminist bank teller than she is like a bank teller. In terms of probability, it doesn't work. But what happens is when you're asked to compute probability, probability is hard. Similarity is immediate. It's a natural assessment. It will come in first, and it will preempt the correct calculation. So that was our argument. It's been contested, including by people in this room, but that's what we proposed, and that was the general idea, that a heuristic is answering the wrong question. That is, you're asked one question, and instead of answering it, you ask a related question, an associatively related question. Now, there are other views of heuristics. I mean, Gerd Gigerenzer, who has a view of heuristics as formal operations that he calls fast and frugal, because they use very little information, and they sometimes reach quite accurate estimates. I would contest that because the way I view this, there's no need for frugal operations. The brain is a parallel processor. It can do many things at once, and it can operate on a lot of information at once, and there may be no need for it to be frugal. Now, we present set by prototypes I have mentioned. Matches intensity I have mentioned. Now, what can't it do? It cannot, I think, deal with multiple possibilities at once. Dealing with multiple possibilities at once is something we do consciously and deliberately. System 1 is bound to the suppression of ambiguity, which means one interpretation. Oops. It cannot do sum-like variables. Sum-like variables, they demand another kind of thinking. So it is not going to do probability properly. It is not going to do economic value properly. And there are other things that it will not do. And here, an important point is how you combine information about individual cases with information with statistical information. I'm going to argue that System 1 has a lot of trouble with statistics. System 1, and here I believe the analogy from perception is very direct. It's intended, or it's designed to deal with individual particular cases, not with ensembles. And it does beautifully when it deals with an individual case. For example, it can accumulate an enormous amount of information about that case. This is what I'm trying to exploit in calling it System 1. You know, it's coming alive. As I'm describing it, you're accumulating information about it. But combining information of various kinds, information about the case and information about the statistics, seems to be a lot harder. And here is an old example. There are two cab companies in the city. In one, 85% of the cabs are blue, and 15% of the cabs are green. And there was a hit-and-run accident at night which involved a cab. And there was a witness. And the witness says the cab was green, which was the minority. And the court tested the witness. And, you know, we can embellish that a little bit. And the court tested the witness. And the finding is the witness is 80% reliable. When the witness says blue and when the witness says green, it's 80% reliable. Can make it more precise, there are complexities, but you get the idea. You ask people, what's your judgment? You've had both of these items of information. And people say 80% by and large. That is, they ignore the base rate and they use the information about the case, the causal information about the case. And it's causal because there is a cause, there's a causal link between the accident and the witness. Now, have a look at a very small variation which changes everything. There are two companies in the city. They're equally large. 85% of cab accidents involve blue cabs. Now this is not ignored. Not at all ignored. It's combined almost accurately with the base rate. So you have the witness who says the opposite. Now what's the difference between those two cases? The difference is that when you read this one, you immediately reach the conclusion that the drivers of the blue cabs are insane. You know, they're reckless drivers. That is true for every driver. It's a stereotype that you have formed instantly, but it's a stereotype about individuals. It is no longer a statement about the ensemble. It is a statement about individual blue drivers. We operate on that completely differently from the way that we operate on merely statistical information, that cab is drawn from that ensemble. So that's a difficulty that System 1 has, and it's also an ability that System 1 has. Well, there is more. I could go on, you know, along those lines, of course. It's been a long study, but I want to talk a bit about marvels and flaws. So far, true to myself, I've spoken mostly of flaws. There is expertise, and expertise is in System 1. That is, expert behavior is in System 1. And most of the time, we are expert in most of what we do. So sometimes, you know, it's very striking. I mean, I like the example that I pick up the phone and Anne says one word and I know her mood. You know, that's very little information, but it's enough. Now that is expertise of a high order. And how did it come about? It came about through reinforced practice. A lot of reinforcement and a lot of practice. Now, so all of us are experts on things. And the stories about fireground commanders or about physicians, you know, who have those marvelous intuitions, they're not surprising. If they have had the opportunity to learn as much about their field as I have about Anne on the telephone, then they're skilled. They're skilled. It's in System 1. It comes with complete confidence. Now, what's interesting is that many a time people have intuitions that are equally confident, except that they're wrong. And that happens through the mechanism that I call the mechanism of substitution. You've been asked a question, and instead you answer another question, but that answer comes by itself with complete confidence, and you're not aware that you're doing something that you're not expert on because you have one answer. Subjectively, whether it's right or wrong, feels exactly the same. And whether it's based on a lot of information or little information, this is something that you may step back and have a look at. But the subjective sense of confidence can be the same for intuition that arise from expertise and for intuitions that arise from heuristics, that arise from substitution and asking a different question. Now, the marvels and the flaws, clearly the marvels are more important than the flaws. you know, in the quantitative sense, in the sense that most of what we do is just fine, and that we are, you know, we're well adapted to our environment, otherwise we wouldn't be here, and so on. The flaws are of some interest, and the difficulty of separating intuitions that are good from intuitions that are not good is of considerable interest, I mean, including applied interest. But that's roughly, you know, where we are. I went back, because we were having that conversation almost 20 years ago, a conversation or a debate with Lida and John about some of our problems. And I'll mention that problem here. This is a study that Amos Tversky and I did about 30 years ago. A health survey was conducted in a sample of adult males in British Columbia of all ages and occupations. Please give your best estimate of the following values. What percentage of the men surveyed have had one or more heart attacks? The average is 18%. What percentage of the men surveyed both are over 55 years old and have had one or more heart attacks? And the average is 30%. And a large majority say that the second is more probable than the first. Now, here is an alternative version of that, which we proposed. Health survey, same story. It was conducted in a sample of 100 adult males, so you have the number. How many of the 100 participants have had one or more heart attacks? And how many of the 100 participants both are over 55 years old and have had one or more heart attacks? This is radically easier. I mean, from a large majority of people making a mistake, you get to a minority of people making a mistake. So percentages are terrible. People out of 100 are easy. Now, and here there is some, I think, really interesting conversation going on about ways to explain this. And Lida and John came up with an evolutionary explanation, which, you know, I think you might want to explain. I came up with a cognitive interpretation. That is, for me, what happens, and we don't have the goods on that, actually, but I'm pretty sure we're right. For me, what happens when I have 100 participants, rather than percentages, I have a spatial representation. And then if I have a spatial representation and, you know, all the 100 participants or the people with one or more heart attacks are in one corner of the room, and then the people who, from that set, who also are over 55 years old, well, there are fewer of them in that corner of the room. So for me, there is a purely cognitive interpretation of the frequency advantage, which is because speaking of individuals, of the number of individuals, calls for a different representation, so far as I'm concerned, in System 1, which will enable you to work with this differently. And yesterday, at lunch, Steve and I were having a conversation that I think is really quite interesting about which of these modes of explanation is the more powerful, or which, and it may turn out that it's not even a question of more powerful. Why do I like one, and why do the three of you guys like another? And, you know, I thought that this might be something on which we might want to spend a few minutes, because, you know, it's a big theme. The evolutionary topic has been a big theme here. And here, you know, I'm coming, and it's not that I don't believe in evolution. I mean, it must be very clear from what I've said that, you know, this is anchored, but it is not anchored in the idea that evolution has created optimal solutions to these problems. That it is not anchored in. And I thought that, you know, we might want to answer any questions, or else we might just want to discuss this problem. And I'm done.
see those as incompatible explanations, right? I think it's exactly correct that when you represent these as individual countable entities, you get different. It engages different mechanisms. And one of my former students, the one that on that paper with the breaking apart, the putting together the Skalki stuff with the agency, I haven't read it yet, but he's done some work trying to pull apart. Some people have claimed that when you have these, like icons, for example, icons help even little children. But when you have the icons, some people claimed it just makes you see the relation of the sets more clearly. And he has some evidence I've heard, but I have from various people I haven't read myself, that there's still an additional, that there may be something to that, but there's an additional help from the icons per se, beyond just understanding the sets. And so for us, it's more that looking at it from this, asking this other question of, well, in what form would you have experienced, I mean, you know, birds forage for food, all animals forage for food, they have to solve problems of judgment under uncertainty, that the format in which information would have been presented to you ancestrally would have been in these natural frequencies. And so that if you were going to have mechanisms that could take care of these problems, you might expect them to operate on those formats. And then there was this other argument that was very interesting to me that, well, I can't remember the name of it now, I'm getting old and I can't remember the name. The idea is that as you go around the world, it has to do with absolute numbers, as opposed to natural sampling, that's right. So I'm going through a forest, and it has cherry trees and apple trees in it. And as I'm going through the forest, I'm encountering both, and some have ripe fruit and some don't have ripe fruit. And if I want to know, given that I see red fruit, you know, how likely is it that that's, you know, of the trees with ripe fruit, let me put the frequency way, of the trees with red fruit, how many are cherry trees? That if a little tabulator in my mind is just picking up the numbers of red fruit and the hits and false alarms, red fruit and cherry tree, the number of those, and red fruit and apple trees, then the base rate is actually implicit in those numbers because it's implicit in how I've encountered them. It's implicit in the encounter rate in that forest. And so it's sort of interesting because that gives a reason for thinking, well, why should absolute frequencies be so much easier than other ones? So I don't see them as competing. I don't actually see them as competing explanations. I see them as kind of complementary.
I think that this to me has been quite interesting because at some stage it was presented as a controversy. And we now seem, you as well as I, to feel that there is no controversy.
I think that more of the controversy was more about what you were talking about initially about so is it, you know, to what extent is something badly designed versus well designed, right? And I'm curious.
And what is the method for discovering whatever is the cognitive design?
Well, I mean, that is what I find most interesting, actually, because we seem to have, different ways of discovering phenomena or looking for phenomena. And so you have a theory, and you know you have an image which is much clearer than mine of what the ancestral environment was in, and it gives you ideas about what the ancestral environment would make easy for people or hard for humans to. And I get my ideas from somewhere else, but fundamentally, is there any difference between the kind of cognitive psychology that we're doing?
I think there is in the following sense that, first of all, I mean, we agree with, and I can speak for my wife, and check me out.
No.
that it's a brilliant approach to concentrate on errors, because as you say, it's the Freud might have said, it's the royal road to discovering the actual algorithm that's being used, right? And on the other hand, there's an infinite number of cognitive tasks you can bombard subjects with. What's the best life insurance package? All sorts of things, okay? And if you look at those, then people are going to be making, according to various normative theories, they're going to be making mistakes left, right, and center, okay? And then the kind of characterization of the competences of the subject and the design of the architecture is based on deviations from a normative theory, which is drawn from statistics or logic or something like that. On the other hand, if you change the question to what would you expect of an evolutionary history in which not all problems of all formats are encountered with equal frequency, but some things are encountered all the time, and other things are encountered very rarely or not at all. And therefore, you would expect that the architecture would have been shaped to perform well on the common task. And therefore, that you find, instead of this discourse which did exist about the incapacity and biases and so on of the system, and therefore the great weakness of human cognitive architecture, you find these procedures which work really superbly well on the kinds of adaptive problems that we've encountered for tens of thousands of generations. And that gives you all of a sudden this perspective that opens for you. Wow! Instead of there not being a calculus of probability in mind, there's really good things there in there which are very sophisticated that you wouldn't have come across if you didn't ask the question: what's a natural task for the human brain, and what's an arbitrary, transient, recent?
Yeah, I don't think I want to get into the details of the cheater detection problem, which is complicated. There are really striking similarities in the way that, say, I would look at where we would expect good performance. So I've had this work with Gary Klein, who is another John's clients and recently was on Edge, who is a great promoter of intuition and belief. And we worked for a number of years to write a joint paper on when does intuition work and when doesn't it work. And one thing I cited earlier, which is that looking at subjective confidence will not do it, because you get high subjective confidence with intuitive answers, right or wrong. We are also looking at the environment for an answer, but we're looking at the current environment. So our question is, what opportunities were available for the individual to learn a skill? And if there were opportunities to learn a skill, then presumably the skill has been learned. If there were adequate opportunities with immediate feedback, the skill has been learned and it will work. We're not looking at the ancestral environment, we're looking at the current environment. So we, for example, claim that somebody who thinks that he can make long-term political predictions is deluded because the environment doesn't support long-term political predictions that would be valid, or that Wall Street, the data on the stock market do not support adequate or precise. So we would also look at the environment. We're just looking at the current environment, not...
The current environment is also, nothing in what we're suggesting it says that there shouldn't be ontogenetically calibration to your current environment. There should be mechanisms that calibrate you to your current environment. But I would think it would be very hard, even with a lot of expertise. I don't challenge the Linda thing. Everybody gets the same results with the Linda thing put in that way, and I don't even dispute the explanation that you give for it. It's just that the thing that was interesting to me is that when Klaus Fiedler put it in the other, and you did it too, in the other format, you get this very different answer. What I think would be, so for example, if I wanted to make somebody more expert in reasoning about probability, I would want to give them the information in a frequency format, because I think that no matter how much you train them with the single event, and with the single event probabilities, they can have all kinds of expertise, but lots of times they're getting the expertise because they figured out to transform it into frequencies and think about it about it that way. You know,
there is no disagreement. Actually, what we're talking about is where do our ideas come from? Because I don't think there is a significant disagreement. I never did believe that there was a deep disagreement. You are inspired by a certain way of doing things, and it leads you into certain kind of hypotheses.
Yes.
And I'm playing a different game on, you know, in the same terrain, and I get my hypotheses from something else. I don't see the controversy, is really my point.
I have a question for you, which feel free to not answer it but
I probably will answer it.
But it has to do, so we were at Stanford, I used to go to Amos's lab groups and so forth. And I get a different sense when I listen to you and when I listen to Amos about your emphases. Because when I listen to you, but you, of course you wrote together, and so, you know, you're a student reading these papers, it's a joint product and both minds are contributing to that joint product. When I listen to you, I get a sense of an interest in the psychological mechanisms. When I'd be in Amos's lab group, it was more of a
on the table and say,
hey, there's no normative theory that could possibly predict thus and such.
and you'd also say, I'm not interested in mechanisms. All we've ever proposed is empirical generalizations.
I said, I mean, he said this, and I said, well, but what's the availability heuristic? That sounds like a mechanism to me. I said, does your collaborator agree with you? I think your collaborators proposed mechanisms. So I'm just curious about, so like for example.
So you're asking about, would Amos agree with me? He's been dead 15 years. I mean,
well, yes, because a very big theme for him, a very big theme was that if it wasn't a normative theory, if it wasn't, that the only real normative theories would be logic and subjective expected utility theory. Whereas if you're coming from an evolutionary biology perspective, you know, risk-sensitive foraging theory is a normative theory, but it's about fitness maximization. It's not about these other things. And so from our point of view, there are other normative theories. The world of normative theories goes beyond just those. And so, yes, I'm curious about, you know, the interplay and what each of you thought. And
well, I mean, obviously, Amos and I were quite different people, and so we differed even when we worked together. We didn't have exactly. I mean, I was more interested in mechanism and less interested in normative rules than he was. And, you know, he's been dead 15 years, and most of the things that are important to me in this have been happening in the last 15 years. I mean, we have a new understanding of associative memory, which to me changes the whole picture about what cognition is. And that we didn't have. Amos and I never had a coherent view of two systems. We felt vaguely that they were two systems. And in the sense that there are certain experiments that you run when you believe in two systems that you don't if you don't draw that distinction. So for us it was a very sharp distinction between asking people direct comparisons or asking them to judge, you know, as in this cheese problem. When you show the two sets, then it's clear that logic applies. When you show them one at a time, then your gut tells you that set B, which is the smallest set, is worth more. So we had that, but we were not clear. This has become clearer in the last 15 years. It's just
Can I ask you a second question about this, this system 1, system 2, and the role of language? So, I mean, of course, with numbers, right? There's now been this various work on number cognition and so forth, and there's this interesting mapping that happens, not in all cultures, but in some cultures, between words for numbers and this intuitive number system, which when we give these kinds of problems, and when you give these kinds of problems to people, we're assuming that they've done this mapping and so forth. Or in a cheater detection problem, when I give somebody a problem, they need to read the problem. They need to read and understand the scenario in order for the mechanism in order for the rule to be interpreted as a social contract, and then this very fast and, you know, judgment about what information search problem about which cards represent potential cheaters to kick in. And so I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about how you think about the relationship between what you think of as system 2 and system 1 and language.
well, mostly, I think, that it's a strange relationship between the two systems. I mean, now I'm verifying them and describing them as interacting. I think that, of course, System 1 makes many suggestions. It comes up first with suggestions, with intentions, with impressions. And System 2 mostly endorses them. So it's an endorsement, there's some monitoring going on, and most of the time it's like an editor who, has a quick look at the copy that's coming in from the journalists and sends it to the printer. So that is a large part of what goes on.
But there's at the front end too, because when you speak, I have to be better representing the words you're saying and interpreting them before it can activate this intuitive system. I mean, and so there's this interesting interface that's happening through language.
I believe that System 1 understands language. I mean, it's not clearly, language is not System 2, language is System 1.
Okay.
Otherwise it wouldn't work.
Because a lot of times lately there's just been strange, especially in social psychology, the strange thing where they think that something is not an automatic system if they, during the interpretive process, when somebody has to interpret the situation, they put some kind of cognitive load. So you're not even really knowing what the scenario you're reading is about because you're thinking about counting backwards by threes or something like this, and that you can't magically do a problem under those circumstances, they think speaks against that it's something from System 1. Whereas you can do the same thing where you have the person read the scenario and then you give them some sort of cognitive load and it has no effect on their performance indicators as well afterwards. And so there's a lot of sort of funny things going on in the literature about that.
There are interesting differences. I'll give you an example. One thing that, in my reading at least, System 1 can do, it generates an attitude to things. So there are things you like them more, you like them less. That's System 1, the immediate emotional response to something. Choice, which is an explicit comparison, always involves System 2 and is always effortful. So there is a very sharp boundary there about certain things that are guaranteed to call, System 2 is going to get called, like in 27, like in 24/17, and choice as well. I think we should probably stop.
I just have a thought from a computer science perspective. If you compare the task of averaging versus summation, the obvious difference is that summation involves an accumulator, so there's this variable. And when we do machine learning, it tends to fall into two systems. Maybe you're slightly analogous to this, I don't know how much. One is the kind of system where there's sort of learning averages and you don't create new variables or what you might call models. And so you just have, you're just tracking some sort of fiduciary marker in a data set. And then there's others where there's a stored model that you're comparing against. And to have the stored model, you need to have a different architecture. You have some sort of random access memory thing, whereas if you don't have that, you can have a sort of a pipeline model, which is sometimes called digital signal processing or something. And I've often wondered if things we're conscious of correspond to the creation of new stored structures. Because the thing is, when you're going to create a new stored variable, when you're going to create a model, the number of potential mistakes expands enormously, is one way to put it. But if you have a DSP model where you have the same state, you're just optimizing within an energy landscape, you can kind of in a Bayesian way kind of find your way into a local or maybe even a global optimized point. But if you're adding new state, you have this truly gigantic explosion of possible errors, and so it's a much more energy intensive and much harder to test sort of a thing. So I would note that you're conscious of learning new vocabulary, but not necessarily of using it. And so there's this, I think there's this,
the distinction, I think, between sum-like and other variables is fascinating. And clearly there is a big gap between them. And what I've called System 1 is clearly able to do one. It deals with individual cases. That's what happened, in the example of the cabs. When you get the stereotypes, you have one cab. You don't have to do things, to combine statistical information with single case information. It all goes into the single case, and then it works fine.
Well, as an example, in machine vision, you can start with a given you start with a prototype facial map, and then you scan an environment for fiducial elements that match a face. You can find faces, you can track faces, but you haven't actually added to your model space. If you instead wanted to find a task where I'm going to show you arbitrary new pieces of visual information, and I want to have emergent new categories, wow, that is an entirely different class of problem, and vastly, vastly more difficult and essentially not understood. And my intuition is that this is something like this System 1, System 2 distinction.
I also think there's a little controversy here, and I would say, without hesitation, if someone were asking what are the most important contributions to human life from psychology, I would identify this work as maybe number one and certainly the top 2 or 3. In fact, I would identify the work of teaching as one of the most important things that we learned I argue this at Harvard, that when we were trying to identify what should any educated person know about the entire expanse of human knowledge, I argued unsuccessfully that work on human cognition and cognitive reasoning should be up there, one of the first things that any educated person should know. So I'm qualified in my respect for how important this work is. So whatever difference in emphasis is really not on whether these are important, profound discoveries, which they are, but where to take them and how to ultimately to explain them. And I think one of the things that you said introducing the talk was I found very informative. You said that the errors are what give us crucial information about how the human mind works. And while I not so much correct performance, and there's a sense in which that's certainly true, there's also a sense in which correct performance is fantastically informative, in the sense that there are very few systems in the world that can do what a human can do. Our computers can't drive our cars for us, they can't make a bed, they can't put away the dishes, they can't understand English sentences. And so the question of how we do things well is informative in the sense that it's not so easy to get something to do well what humans do well. And so the approach of trying to account for the successes strikes me as a converging way of getting at the mind as well as the failures. And in the same way that someone would ask me, how does an automobile engine work, how does the eye work, to characterize all of the errors and the flaws is an important source of information. But ultimately, I want to take you to a description of cylinders and spark plugs and carburetor, not necessarily in physiological terms, but even in computational terms, from which the errors would be ultimately deducible as a byproduct of what it does well, given that it's so hard to get something to do well,
I mean, it's difficult, but the idea about errors is that they are much more diagnostic about the mechanism. So there might be different mechanisms for doing the same thing perfectly, and you're not going to be able to distinguish the mechanism by observing it. Where there is some convergence is, Gary Klein and our conclusion was, if you want to distinguish good intuitions from bad intuitions, don't look inside, don't look at the person, look at the environment. And will the environment support good intuitions? And that's essential. And there, so I think that what happened was in part just that we were identified with flaws.
Yes.
And so people thought we liked flaws. And it's interesting in terms of the conduct of the debate. So the debate about Linda, and there's been a lot of debate, there are two kinds of arguments two kinds of debates. In one kind of debate, you go after the strongest argument that the other person has made. In other kinds of debates, and it's legitimate, you go after the weakest argument that the other person has made. And that is what you do when you want to discredit them. The argument about Linda has been a discrediting kind of argument. That is, it's taken the most extreme case that we did not believe would be robust, and it showed that it's not robust. It's perfectly legitimate in an ideological thing, because we were seen as claiming that people make many mistakes. It's an ideological claim. Now you can find that here is a problem where you can show that people are not making such terrible mistakes. It's a discrediting argument. So there's been a lot of ideology around this, and a lot of noise and a lot of smoke. But I had that conversation with Rod Fertwig, and he says, you have no right to complain. So I'm not complaining. Yeah.